SSIS Handling Events in Custom.NET Code. When you're running an SSIS package, all sorts of events are getting thrown off. For example, if you've got an error, that would be an OnError event. Or if you have a warning, that would be an OnWarning event. Or you can have a PostExecute event. There's a whole handful of different events that are constantly getting thrown off. Well, you can configure your event handlers to react to whatever events are getting thrown. In this nugget, we'll talk about how to handle events, and we'll also talk about the event scope. For example, there's a difference between handling an event on the package level versus handling the same type of event on a task level. We'll also look at the different types of events, such as OnWarning, OnInformation, pre-validation, post-validation, and so on. And then the last thing we'll talk about is creating our own custom.NET code. This can be either in Visual Basic or Visual C#. So you can create your own custom script component or your own script task. Let's get started with handling our events. Here we have a list of the predefined SSIS events. I've starred the first three here because these are the most common ones that we'll be handling. So OnError is of course for when an error occurs. OnWarning is for warnings, but it doesn't necessarily terminate the program. And then OnPostExecute is thrown after something has executed. So there are other events here. For example, OnExecStatusChanged occurs when an executable's status has changed. OnInformation is, yes, just for information. So for example, if a task successfully completed and maybe the task inserted records, it might provide information on those inserted records. We have OnPostValidate and OnPreExecute, as well as OnPreExecute, and we discussed OnPostExecute. OnProgress is when a measurable progress has occurred, and then OnQueryCancel is if some kind of task has been canceled. If a task fails, it throws an OnTaskFailed event. And then OnVariableValueChanged is going to be thrown whenever some kind of variable has changed. So a lot of these are pretty self-explanatory, just looking at the names of the events. And what's also important to understand is that when you're handling these different events, there are different attributes that are associated with each of these. For example, some of these have a description associated with them, some of them do not. We're going to do a simple example here. We're going to do a quick example of creating our own specific event handlers. So you'll see here that we've got a control flow that says extract from flat file, and if we double click on that, that takes us to the data flow of what's actually going on. So it's extracting from the contacts file, looking up the postal code, and then going to our database table. So back to this control flow. Keep in mind that we might have multiple tasks inside of this control flow. Well, how does event handling work? Well, if you click on your event handlers, you'll see that we have two different fields we need to populate. One is the executable, so we can be specific with the task that we're applying an event handler to, or we can say that it's for a specific package. Remember, you might have multiple packages. So what we're saying here is that you can have event handling on multiple levels, and let's say that you have an event handler on this task right here, and you also have an event handler of the same type for the package. Well, the event handler down here is going to handle the event first. So let's talk about our different types of event handlers. You'll see here in this drop-down we have several different event handlers. The three most common ones are OnError, OnWarning down here, and then there's OnPostExecute. Let's say that we wanted to create our own custom event handling for the error, and instead of having it on the extract from flat file executable, we're just going to make it for the package as a whole. So just go like that, and then we'll hit OK. Now, we can click here to create an OnError event handler. So that just opens up this palette right here, and then we can look at our different options. We're going to perform some logging. So let's take a look. I'm just going to drag my SQL Server Management Studio over here. And you'll see that under my database here are my tables. I created my own custom table called event log. You can call yours whatever you want to. Okay, but you'll see here that the event log has the event type, which is varchar, the package name, which is also varchar, the name of the task, the server that this happened on, and the timestamp. So all of these are varchars except for the timestamp, which of course is a date data type. So once you create that table, remember to create that table, you can just right click on tables and say new table and follow the wizard. Once you've done that, then you can go on to the next step and create your flow on this page. I can go in here. I'm looking for my toolbox, so I'll just go up to View, Toolbox, and here are all of my different tools. I'm going to grab an Execute SQL task and grab it onto here and drag it on there. And this is my Execute SQL task. I can rename this to something else, such as custom error logging. And just like with your other data flows, you can have many different things occur within this area. For example, I might want to log something in the database, and then I might also want to send a piece of email, or vice versa. Okay, so now that we have that, I can double click on here, and it's asking for the connection. So I'm going to specify the CBT-DB, that's my database connection for my CBT database, and it's going to ask us for the SQL statement. So I'm just going to click on this ellipsis and I'm going to say insert into, and remember you can go back to your SQL Server Management Studio and look at your different tables. Okay, so here we have our event log and we have E-type, package, task, server, and TS. So drag that back over there and we'll say insert into event log with E-type, package, task, server, TS, and then we'll have values. And we can put placeholders in here if we want. The only thing I'm going to hard code in here is the word error. So anytime an error occurs, this event handler will take over. So here I'm going to then put in 4 placeholders for the other fields. Now, after we create that statement, we need to define what those placeholders represent. So that's where we go into parameter mapping, and then I can add my different parameters here. So I'm going to drag this over here, and we have all sorts of built-in variables. And I'm concerned about the name of the package, so here it is, package name. And the data type, we're going to make this varchar, and make the parameter name be 0. That's just a placeholder, which means the first question mark. Then we hit add, and we do the same thing for the other 3 parameters. So the next one is task. Here's my task name, varchar, placeholder 1. Next one is server. It's actually machine name that we're looking for, right there. And placeholder 2. And then the last one is going to be for the start time. In other words, the timestamp of when this thing occurred. So we'll just grab that right there. And instead of saying long or varchar, we're going to say date. And this will be placeholder number 3. Then we hit OK. So there's our custom error logging. We can then test this. So what I've done is I've gone into the flat file and I've modified the contents a little bit to where you see this third entry here is missing that number there, so this will cause it to fail. And we'll go ahead and start debugging. So you'll see here the extract from flat file failed. I can now look at my Management Studio and we can query our table. Okay, so I'll just open up this query window and I'll say use CBT, DB, and then I'll do a select star from event log and execute that. And you'll see that we have our timestamp. And if we wanted to get even fancier, we could have, let me go ahead and close this debugging, stop debugging, Now if you want to get a little fancier, you can go to your event handling page, and you can also say, you know what, during my event handling I want to send out a piece of mail. So you can drag that send mail task and then make the arrow go from there to there. We need to double click on send mail and add the appropriate parameters. In other words, we need to specify the SMTP connection. Okay, if you don't already have one in the drop-down, you can always follow the wizard by clicking New Connection. You specify who this is from, and who it's to. And then you can put in a subject. Error occurred during package execution. And the message source type, just say direct input. And for the message source, you can hard code that in there, or you can just click on expressions and put some dynamic content in there. For example, under the property, I can say, you know what, our message source, and you hit this little ellipsis here, and this is where you can say an error occurred on machine, and then give the machine name. You can extract it from these variables up here. Here's our machine name, and you can also give the timestamp. You can also give a nice little error description. And here it is right there. So any of these variables that you're interested in, you can just drag them over here. And there you go. You can click on this evaluate expression to make sure everything's okay. Now, if you get an error like this, have no fear. The only problem that you've got is that you've forgotten, most likely, your double quotes that enclose everything. So I'm just going to put double quotes right here. Now we can evaluate the expression, and it looks beautiful. So now we can hit OK, OK again, OK again. And so now whenever an error occurs, it will send the mail task, and then it will perform custom error logging. Now, if you want to get a little fancier and have some very specific code that goes into .NET assembly, you can do that as well. So that will be our next task. Now, there will be times when you want to create your own custom SSIS task. I mean, we've got a pretty big toolbox to work with, but sometimes you want to do something really customized that you can only implement with .NET. That's either with Visual Basic or Visual C#. One thing we could do as far as customized scripts go is we could pull information from a flat file and then create our own customized script, either using Visual Basic or C#. Maybe you want to have some kind of logic in there with if then else statements. For example, if we wanted to take a last name and first name and say, if the first name is null, then the full name is this. If the first name is not null, then concatenate the last name, comma, first name, things like that. In our example, we're going to use Visual Basic.NET. So I'm just going to, first of all, just create a new project here. I'm going to make sure that it's SSIS. So here we go, Integration Services Project, and then hit OK. If you want to rename this, you can. Maybe call this Custom VB Script. Okay, so there is our skeleton code. So now what we need to do is under here, we're under our control. Make sure that you take a data flow task and drag it onto there. Now the data that we have to work with, if we double click on here, we're going to be choosing to import from some kind of flat file. So here we can say flat file source, drag that onto there, and then it's going to ask us what file we want to deal with. Well, I have a flat file that's directly sitting under my C drive, so we can just go ahead and right click on the connection managers, and we'll say new flat file connection. Okay, the file name, let's just browse to that location. And here is our addresses file. And then we can go on to our columns. And you'll see here we have generic column names. I'm going to give these more meaningful names. Let me move this over a little bit so you can see it all. The first column is our ID. Second column is last name. Then we have first name, street, city, state, and zip code. So I'm going to make these a little more meaningful. So go under Advanced and rename these. This shouldn't take very long at all. Here we have our first name, street, city, and then our state, and then our zip code, or you can just say postal. Okay, so there we go. And then we can take a preview of our actual data in there. So you'll see that we do have data in there. And we can go in there and modify some things if you want. We'll do that in just a moment. I'll go ahead and hit OK right there. Now our flat file source has this red X there. Let's right click on there and edit it. Make sure that we're pointing to our data connection. Okay, so here's our flat file connection manager. We called that addresses. And once again, here's our preview. Looks great. So let's go ahead and hit OK. And you should no longer see the X on there. Now we're going to have, as I mentioned, some custom VB script. So what we're going to do is under our data flow transformations, I want you to find script component and drag that onto there. And when you drag it on, it asks you, is this going to be a source, destination, or transformation? Let's stick with transformation because, of course, the source is our flat file and our destination is eventually going to be a database table. So let's go ahead and make sure that this arrow, this green arrow, goes from the flat file source to our script component. If you right click on your script component, you can click on Edit, and you'll see down here the script language. I don't want to do C#, I actually want to do Visual Basic 2008. And then we can look at our input columns as well. So here are our different input columns. We'll just check all of those. Here's our inputs and outputs. So this is where we can provide some output columns so it can then go to our database table. So right now we don't have any output columns. What I'd like to do is take the information from the name and combine that. So for example, we have our last name and our first name. I want to combine that into one column. And then for the street, city, state, zip, I want to combine all of that into just an address column. So what we're going to end up with for our output is an ID, name, and address. So all you need to do is say add column, and let's call this full name, and the data type is going to be string. And let's do the same thing, add column, do this for the address. Once again, make sure it is string. Let's take a closer look at our script components. So once again, I'll right click on there. You'll see that there's this button here that says Edit Script, and this will give us some skeleton Visual Basic script code. Okay, so here's our script code. Let's take a look here. We have a method here called PreExecute, another one called PostExecute, and the one that we want to pay attention to is this right here, the subroutine called input 0 process input row. And so we have a variable to work with called row, and that represents the data that's coming into our script component. So whatever columns we have available, we can say row dot and then the column name, and we can access it. I'm going to declare a couple variables, so I'll just say dim, and maybe I'll call this name as, and we'll make this a string, and we'll declare another one called address, or just ADDR, as string. So here we have two variables, and then we're going to be defining them and then setting them to the output at the end of this subroutine. So we're going to have an if statement. We're going to say if not row dot, and we're looking at first name is null. In other words, if the first name is not null, then we're going to be setting our name. So we can say name equals row dot last name and concatenate to that maybe a comma and a space followed by the first name. Then we can put an else statement in here. Else name equals row dot last name. And you can do the same sort of thing with the address. We can start off by saying ADDR equals row dot street. So we're assuming that street is always populated. And then we can say if row dot city is null, or actually we can say if it's not null, then we're going to do something. So we can say ADDR equals ADDR and concatenate a comma and then the city. I'm going to do the same sort of thing for our state and our postal code. So I'll just copy this, paste it, and tweak it. So change this to be like that. Paste it again. Almost finished. Okay, any changes we want to make here? Maybe I don't want to have a comma after or before the state. Maybe I don't want to have a comma before the postal. So in other words, I just want to have a space between those, and that's fine. Now the last thing we want to do is take these values of these variables and set them to the output variables that we just defined. So we can say row dot full name equals name. And our row dot full address equals ADDR. So far looking good. We'll go ahead and save this and get back to our main screen, so you can just exit out of this window here. Let's take one more look here at our inputs and outputs. If we take a look at our inputs here we have our ID, name information, address information, but in the output we don't explicitly specify the ID, and that's okay. It's just going to get passed through. Okay, so I'll just hit OK there. At this point we want to add a destination, so this will be an OLE DB destination, and make sure that this green arrow goes from our script component to the OLE DB destination. Now we're going to associate a connection manager to this OLED destination. Right click on there and let's say edit, and we're going to specify our connection manager. So the name of my server is Julie1 and my database is CBTDB, so I hit OK right there. And then the table that I'm accessing is the customers table. And if I want to take a preview of that, this is what is in my actual database table. I'm going to delete all these records here in just a moment. We also want to take a look at our mappings. Okay, so here is the available input. You'll see that the ID is getting passed through here already. And then we want to map on the full address to the address right here and the full name over here. So now that we have everything set up, we can hit OK. And I'm going to open up my SQL Server Management Studio, and I'm going to delete those records in the table. Connect to my database. And we're going to issue a new query. I'll make sure that I say use cbt underscore db, and then I will delete from customers. And then we can execute it. Okay, 10 rows were affected, so I no longer have that data. That looks great. And now the other thing I'm going to do is go into my flat file and modify a little bit of data here. Maybe I want to get rid of the first name just to test the functionality. Maybe I want to remove maybe a city in there, or even a state, so we can test this out. So I'll just save that. And now to test it. So let's just hit our green arrow. We'll start debugging, and we should see green across the board. And if we don't, we'll make some fixes. Okay, let's see what we have here. It looks like 5 rows got processed through there. That looks great. Let's actually check our data. So we're going to go into our actual database, back to our SQL Server Management Studio. And instead of saying delete from customers, we're going to say select star from customers. And then execute it. Oh, this is looking great. Okay, we'll move that out of the way. And we can now stop our debugging. Okay, so that was our custom VB scripting. And of course, if you prefer using C#, you can do that as well. Let's review what we learned in this nugget. We first of all talked about handling events. We have lots of different event types that can be thrown off during the execution of your SSIS. Our focus was on OnError, OnWarning, and OnExecute. So simply go into your Events tab and add whatever handling you need to. We also discussed the event scope. Remember, that's the lifetime of the event. The scope can belong to a package, or it can belong to a particular component. If it belongs to the package, then all of the different components within that package can actually access it. Then we focused on creating our own custom .NET code. It can be either Visual Basic or C#, and you'll want to create a script component and specify which language you're using. And be sure to add any input and output parameters that you need to. Well, I hope this has been informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.